She was 56 years old and had just signed the papers that ended 29 years of marriage on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, in a law office on Spark Street in Ottawa that smelled of old carpet and printer toner. Her name was Frances Alderton. She walked out of that office with a certified check for $6,400, the 2011 Honda Civic she had bought herself 8 years earlier, and a garbage bag of personal items her husband had left in the front hallway of the house she could no longer enter. The check was her half of the joint savings account. The rest, the house in Westboro, the investment portfolio, the ski chalet near Mont Tremblant, those were Gordon's. Those had always been Gordon's, even when they were supposed to be theirs. She sat in her car in the parking garage on Metcalf for 40 minutes before she could make herself turn the key. Before we go any further, if stories like this one find you at the right moment, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Frances Evelyn Alderton had been born in a small town called Harrow Lake, Ontario, 2 hours southwest of Ottawa, in January of 1968. Her father had run the hardware store on the main street for 31 years. Her mother had been the town librarian. Frances grew up knowing every book on those shelves by its spine, the way other children know their neighbors' faces. She read everything. She read fast and she read wide, and she read the way some people eat when they are not sure when the next meal is coming. She had left Harrow Lake at 18 for Queen's University in Kingston, where she studied history and fell in love with the archives. The actual physical archives, the reading rooms with the white cotton gloves and the folders of paper that had not been touched in 60 years. There was something about holding a document that had outlived the person who wrote it. She could not explain it then, and she cannot explain it now, but it pulled at her in a way that nothing else did. She met Gordon Alderton in her second year. He was in the business program, confident and easy in the way of men who have never had to second-guess themselves. He had a way of walking into rooms as if he had already been there before. She married him at 24, the same year she was offered a position in the graduate program in archival studies at the University of Ottawa. She deferred. Just for a year, she told herself. Gordon had just started at the firm, and they had agreed that she would work first so he could get his footing. She took a job as an administrative assistant at Library and Archives Canada on Wellington Street. She stayed for 29 years. She told herself for most of those years that she was still going back to school, still going to write the papers she had meant to write, still going to do the research that had kept her awake at 20 years old, with her heart going too fast. She told herself this in the same way a person tells themselves they will start the diet on Monday. Monday never came. Instead, she organized other people's research. She cataloged, she retrieved, she filed, she answered questions from historians and journalists and genealogists, with the patient efficiency of a woman who had long since stopped asking questions herself about her own life. She was good at her work. She was very good at it. She just was not sure, somewhere underneath, if it was her work. Gordon told her about the other woman on a Friday evening in August. They had just come back from dinner at a restaurant on Elgin Street that she had chosen because it was their anniversary. 29 years. He told her in the kitchen, standing in the doorway with his jacket still on. Her name was Christine. She was 33 years old and worked in his firm's Vancouver office. It had been going on, he said, for 2 years. He was sorry. He had not known how to say it sooner. He thought it was better to say it now than to keep going. Frances was at the counter pouring 2 glasses of wine she had taken from the rack before they left for dinner, because she had planned to toast 29 years in their kitchen when they got home. She set the bottle down very carefully. She looked at the 2 glasses. Then she turned around and looked at her husband. She had known. That was the part she could not tell anyone for a long time, the part she still finds hard to say out loud. She had known for at least a year. Not known exactly, but known in the way your body knows things before your mind agrees to look at them. She had chosen not to look. She understood, standing in that kitchen on their anniversary, that she had chosen not to look because looking meant becoming a different person than the one she had been for 29 years. And she was not sure she knew how to be anyone else. She said, very quietly, "You should go," and he went. The settlement took 3 months. The house in Westboro had been purchased in Gordon's name before the marriage, a gift from his parents. The chalet had been a business investment structured in a way, her lawyer explained carefully and kindly, and that still left her with almost nothing. Her own pension from Library and Archives Canada was modest. Public service salaries are modest. 29 years of modest salary, and most of what she had saved had gone into the house that was not hers. She walked out of the law office on Sparks Street on a Wednesday in late October with $6,400 and a garbage bag and a car with 214,000 kilometers on it. She sat in the parking garage, and she thought about Harrow Lake. Her great-aunt Cecilia had left her a property. Not her parents. Her great-aunt Cecilia, her grandmother's sister, a woman who had never married, who had lived alone in the same house on the shore of Harrow Lake in the Gatineau Hills for 60 years, who had died in 2011 at the age of 92, sharp-minded to the end and quietly certain about everything. Frances had been paying the property taxes for 12 years by automatic transfer. She had not been to Harrow Lake since she was 31 years old, the summer before her mother got sick. She had almost forgotten, in the way you forget things you cannot afford to think about, that it was hers. She thought about it now. She turned the key in the ignition. She drove north. It was a 90-minute drive up through Chelsea and into the Gatineau Hills, up roads that got narrower and quieter as the maples thickened on either side. The October color was at its peak, the long burning red and orange that people drive hours to see, except that up here there was no one driving to see it. It was just there the way it had always been, indifferent to whether anyone was watching. Frances rolled her window down. The air had a cold mineral edge to it, lake water and granite and fallen leaves already beginning to soften into earth. Her body recognized it before she did. The house was smaller than she remembered. Not smaller, she was bigger. 25 years of her had expanded to fit rooms she no longer lived in, and now she had come back and the scale had shifted. But the house was standing. The roof was intact. A man from the town of Low had been keeping an eye on it, had sent her brief emails twice a year that she had always answered with a check and a thank you. He had done his job. The dock on the lake was sound. The old wood stove in the main room still worked. The wallpaper in the kitchen was the same blue and white stripe it had been when Frances was a child. She built a fire. She sat in her great-aunt Cecilia's wingback chair, the one that still faced the lake window, and she watched the light leave the water in layers, gold to bronze to gray to nothing. For the first time since August, she slept a full night. She stayed through November. She had no plan. She ate from the dry goods she found in the pantry, and the groceries she drove to Low to buy once a week. She walked the lakeshore trail every morning in rubber boots. She read the books her great-aunt had left on the shelves. Mostly history, some poetry, a great deal of natural science. She wrote nothing. She spoke to almost no one. She needed to be quiet for a while, and the lake let her be. But by the end of November she understood that quiet was not enough. The $6,400 was going down. The property taxes were due in the spring. Her pension would not start for 9 more years. She was 56 years old with no immediate income, no one to call, and the nearest town was 30 minutes on a road that would be brutal by January. On a gray Tuesday morning she walked farther than her usual route, up the east trail that climbed above the lake. She had not gone that way since she was a child. The trail ended at a flat open ledge of Canadian shield granite overlooking the lake, and from the ledge she could see the whole north end of Harrow Lake, the tree line, and below the tree line, half hidden in the birch and tamarack, a building she had not thought about in decades. The old station. She had been here once as a girl with Aunt Cecilia. It had been a ranger station once, then a fire watch relay station, then neither. The walls were horizontal log, squared and dovetailed, the kind of construction that lasts 100 years if the roof holds. The roof was green tin, worn but intact. The windows, she counted 6, were shuttered. A rusted padlock hung from a hasp on the door. She stood on the granite ledge with the November wind moving the birch trees below, and she felt something she could not name for a few minutes. Then she recognized it. It was the same feeling she had gotten in the archives at Queen's, holding a folder of letters that had been sealed for 50 years. Something in here, that feeling said. Something nobody has looked at yet. If you're still watching, we need you to subscribe before the next part, because what Frances found inside that building is the part of this story that changes everything. She drove down to the municipality office in Low the following Friday. The clerk was a woman named Annette, who had the look of someone who knew everyone within 40 kilometers and found this entirely satisfying. She pulled up the records without being asked twice. The station had been decommissioned in 1989, transferred to the municipality as abandoned Crown land in 1993, listed for disposal twice without buyers. There was no formal assessed value. The municipality would sell it for $250 plus a transfer fee to close the file. $250, Frances said. Annette looked at her over her reading glasses. We've been trying to get rid of it for 30 years. The foundation's probably gone. There's no power, no septic. You'd be buying a problem. Do you take debit? Annette took debit. She printed the documents, stamped them, and handed Frances a key. A long, old-fashioned key, the kind that belongs to a door that means it. Frances held it in her palm on the drive, back up into the hills. It weighed almost nothing. It weighed more than anything she had carried in years. The padlock had seized with rust, and she had to work the key for 5 minutes before it gave. The door swung inward on hinges that groaned but held. Inside the air was cold and dry. The logs had kept the damp out, and it smelled of pine resin and old paper and something else, something metallic and mineral, like a room that had been keeping a secret for a long time. The main room was maybe 500 square feet. A long oak work table ran along the north wall under the shuttered windows. There were shelving units on the south wall, floor to ceiling, most of them empty. A cast iron stove in the corner, a Quebec heater, the kind that burns for 12 hours on a single load. And on the work table, lined up with a neatness that startled her, were 32 wooden map cases, each one sealed with a strip of brown gum tape that had dried and cracked but still held. She counted them twice. 32. She found a cot frame in the back room, folded flat. She found a wooden chair. She sat down at the table, took her gloves off and peeled back the tape on the first case very slowly, the way she had been trained to handle old documents, the way that had become reflex after 29 years. Inside was a flat roll of paper 40 inches wide, tied with a cotton string. She untied the string. She unrolled the map on the table, holding the corners down with her palms. It was a hand-drawn survey map of the Harrow Lake watershed. The date in the corner, September 1947, and in the bottom right corner in a careful hand, surveyed and drawn by E.P. Morrow, Forestry Division, Ottawa. She went through all 32 cases. Every map was hand-drawn. The dates ran from 1933 to 1971. Some were topographic, some were vegetation surveys. Some were fire hazard assessments with annotations in margins, pine standing, no deadfall, low risk. Notes made by someone who had walked every meter of this terrain on foot. The draftsmanship was meticulous. The handwriting throughout was the same careful hand. E.P. Morrow. She drove to the low library, a single room in the back of the municipal building, open Tuesday and Thursday mornings. And she asked the librarian, a retired teacher named Hubert, who had been volunteering there for 11 years, if he knew anything about a forestry surveyor named Morrow. Hubert's expression changed. Evelyn Morrow? I only have the initials. E.P.A. That's Evelyn Patricia Morrow. He sat down in his chair as if his legs had decided something. She was stationed up here from 1933 to 1971. 38 years. First woman employed full-time by the Forestry Division out of Ottawa, though they didn't advertise that. She lived in the station you just bought. Frances looked at him. She passed in 71, Hubert said. Heart attack. Alone up there. They found her 3 days later. She had no family to speak of. The municipality took everything over and nobody really sorted it out. I always wondered what happened to her maps. He paused. She was something, Evelyn. My father knew her. He used to say she could identify every tree species in the Gatineau by its bark in the dark. Frances drove back to the station. She went straight to the shelving units on the south wall, the ones she had thought were empty. She looked more carefully this time. The third shelf from the bottom, in the left-hand unit, set back behind where the light didn't reach, a wooden crate, nailed shut, with a strip of paper glued to the lid. Personal, not municipality property. E.P. Morrow, 1971. She got a hammer and pry bar from the hardware supply she had bought in Low. She opened the crate slowly. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 things: a leather-bound field journal, a bundle of correspondence tied with kitchen twine, and a rolled canvas. She set them on the table in the order she found them. The journal first. The cover bore a single line in ink. Harrow Lake Station. E.P. Morrow. Commenced May 14, 1933. She opened it. May 14, 1933. First day at the station. 2 days' drive north from Ottawa through roads that were barely roads. The station is sound, but the stove wants cleaning. I have 43 square kilometers to survey by September. I am 22 years old. I intend to do the job properly. Frances set the journal down. She picked it up again. She read on. Evelyn Morrow had written in her field journal every evening for 38 years. The entries ran from 1 line to 3 pages, depending on the day. She wrote about the land with the precision of a scientist and the attention of someone in love with what she was studying. She named individual trees in her survey grids the way other people name pets. She described the progression of the seasons across decades in the same forest, noting changes in waterline and species range and fire scar recovery, with the quiet authority of a woman who had been watching long enough to see patterns that shorter careers miss entirely. But every few months, there was a different kind of entry. In among the vegetation surveys and the rainfall measurements, Evelyn wrote about the people who came to the station. The trappers, the guides, the families who canoed through and made camp on the North Shore. A young Algonquin family she had given shelter to during a September storm in 1938. A veteran from the First War who had been walking the Gatineau 3 weeks because, he said, it was the only place his head got quiet. 2 teenage boys she found hypothermic on the ice in March of 1955 and brought inside and fed and got warm before driving them 40 kilometers to their parents. She wrote about all of them. She recorded the small facts of each encounter, the children's names, the veterans' regiment, what she had cooked on the Quebec heater. Frances slept badly that night. She lay in her great-aunt Cecilia's bed, and she thought about Evelyn Patricia Morrow, who had been 22 years old in 1933, who had driven alone up roads that were barely roads into a station in the Gatineau Hills, and had simply begun, with the calm of someone who had decided that this was where she belonged, and this was the work she was going to do. 38 years, alone, with a wood stove and a drafting table and 43 square kilometers of forest to know. Frances had spent 29 years making things accessible to other researchers. She had spent 29 years organizing other people's questions about other people's pasts. And she had been very good at it. And she had told herself it was enough. And she had known for most of that time that it wasn't, and she had nodded. She had always nodded. In the second week of December, she hired a local man named Percy Tulloch, 63 years old, who had a carpentry business out of Gracefield and who, when she mentioned Evelyn Morrow's name while describing the building, stopped mid-sentence. My grandmother took shelter in that station in 1938, he said. Her and my grandfather and their 3 kids got caught in a September gale on the lake. Evelyn Morrow fed them and gave them the back room and had them on their way by morning. My grandmother talked about her whole life. He paused, looking at the roofline. I'll tell you the truth about the rate. I'd usually charge $800 for the roof work you're describing. I'll do it for $4. Why? Frances asked. He looked at the station for a moment before answering. Because it's hers, he simply. Percy and his son worked for 2 weeks at least. When they were done, the roof was tight and the windows were reseated and the Quebec heater had been cleaned and lined and could be trusted again. Frances spent the rest of December working on her own. She swept and scrubbed and oiled the oak table. She had the power and water connected. She inventoried every map case, transcribing the metadata from each one into a notebook, in the same careful way she had cataloged materials at Library and Archives Canada, except that this time she wasn't doing it for anyone else. She read the journal in the evenings, 2 or 3 entries at a time, rations, the way you ration things you don't want to end. It was in the April 1944 entry that the tone changed. April 3, 1944, a letter from James's regiment. He is coming home in June. I have been keeping this to myself for 3 weeks because writing it down makes me afraid it will go wrong. James Vaillancourt. He appeared in the journal only 3 times before the war. A game warden from the Pontiac region who had spent time near the station in the summer of 1940, who had helped her run a boundary survey in the Harrow Lake tributary network, who had a good eye for the land and knew when to be quiet. Evelyn did not write about feelings directly. She wrote about weather and tree canopy and water table readings. But in those 3 entries before 1941, there was a quality to the language that was different, more particular. The details were finer. You noticed June 14, 1944. James came to the station this afternoon. He looks thin. He does not talk about France. I made a pot of soup and we sat outside until dark and he was quiet and I let him be quiet. He is here. That is the thing. August 20, 1944. He drove back down to Pontiac. This morning he will write. I know he will. Frances turned the page. September 1944, October, November. The entries return to the forest. Rainfall, fire hazard. The late color in the maple stands on the south slope. But in December 1, 1944, a letter from James's mother in Shawville. He was in a motor accident on the highway outside of Renfrew in October. He did not survive it. She found my address in his things. She was very kind in how she wrote it. I went out and walked the full perimeter of the survey grid, all 8 kilometers in the dark. I don't know why. I came back and lit the stove, and it is enough that I am here. It will have to be enough. Then 3 blank pages. Then, in early January 1945, a single line. The trees don't stop growing because I am sad. I will get up. And she had gotten up. 38 years had said so. Frances sat in the station with the journal closed on the table in front of her, and she did not try to stop herself crying. She cried for Evelyn Morrow, who had been 33 years old, when she walked 8 kilometers in the dark in December. Alone, she cried for James Vaillancourt, who had come home from France and then did not come home from a highway in Renfrew County. She cried for all of it. Then she thought about Gordon. About 29 years. About all the Monday mornings she had told herself she would go back to what she loved. Evelyn had never had that argument with herself. Evelyn had made her decision in 1933 and kept making it. Quietly, alone every day until she couldn't. In early February, Frances opened the bundle of correspondence. 211 letters, bound in small groups by year with kitchen twine. She counted them at the table under the lamp. The return addresses came from all over: Ottawa, Shawville, Maniwaki, Marnjale Knife, Whitehorse, Alert Bay. People Evelyn had encountered at the station or along the survey routes over 38 years, who had written to the one address they had for her, the only address she ever had. Harrow Lake Station, Gatineau Hills, Quebec. She opened them in order. Dear Miss Morrow, this is the family of Henri and Marguerite Papineau. You will not remember us, but you sheltered our parents in September 1938 during the storm. Our mother spoke of you every time September came. She named her youngest daughter Evelyn. She is 19 now. Thank you for what you gave our family that night. Dear Miss Morrow, my name is Terry Odjick. You pulled me and my cousin Raymond off the ice on Harrow Lake in March of 1955. I was 14 years old. I am writing from Yellowknife. I am a land surveyor. I thought about you when I chose the work. I don't know if you'll remember us, but I know you saved us. Thank you. Dear Evelyn, I hope I may call you Evelyn now. This is Walter Braun, the veteran you let into the station in October of 1936. You gave me tea and a bed, and you didn't ask me a single question I didn't want to answer. I have thought about that many times since. I want you to know I got better. It took a long time, but I got better. It took Frances 2 weeks to read all 211 letters. She read them in the evenings in the wingback chair she had brought over from the lake house, the one that had been her great-aunt Cecilia's, positioned under the lamp near the Quebec heater. The fire crackled. The lake was silent under snow outside. Every person had believed they were the only one. Every letter writer thought they were writing to Evelyn Morrow about a single incident, a night in a storm, an afternoon on ice, a cup of tea that had mattered more than the writer could quite explain. None of them knew about the others. None of them knew that the station had been doing this for 38 years, one person at a time, sheltered and fed and let be. That is how quiet steadiness works. It does not announce itself. It does not accumulate a story until someone sits down to count. The third thing in the oilcloth was the canvas. She had left it for last, not sure why, some instinct about saving. She unrolled it on the table. It was a painted map, not a survey, a painting, done in careful watercolor, showing the full Harrow Lake watershed as seen from the air, or rather as seen from the mind of someone who had walked every part of it. The detail was extraordinary. Every bay of the lake was true, every ridge. In the bottom right corner, unsigned but in Evelyn's hand, Harrow Lake as I found it. 1971. It was the last year she had been alive. Frances stood and looked at that painting for a long time. She said out loud to the empty station, I'm going to make sure people know about you. I promise. That was the week Derek Pallister showed up. He arrived in a black pickup with the logo of a land development company from Gatineau on the door. He was 50 years old and had the quick, certain energy of a man who had spent his career turning properties into other things. He shook Frances's hand in the driveway of the station on a bright, cold February morning and told her he had been watching the Harrow Lake North Shore parcels for 2 years. His company had already optioned the 3 adjacent lots. With her parcel added, they had a viable site for a private 4-season resort compound. He was prepared to offer her $160,000 cash, closing in 45 days. Frances heard the number. She heard it very clearly. She was standing in snow in a place where she had no income, no pension for 9 years, $1,840 remaining in her checking account. $160,000 was the rest of her life, if she was careful. It was never worrying again. It was the beginning of something different and probably easier. She asked him to give her a week. "I can give you 5 days," he said. "Other parties are interested." "A week," she said again. He drove away. Those 5 days, she only took 5, were the hardest she had spent since the drive out of Ottawa. She ran the numbers every night. She thought about Evelyn Morrow's painted map. She thought about 38 years of journals in a crate that had been nailed shut and sitting on a shelf since 1971 because there was no one to open it. She thought about 211 letters that had never been answered because Evelyn had died before they reached whatever critical mass would have made the story visible. On the 4th night, she unrolled the painted map on the table again and sat with it under the lamp. And she thought about something she had done for 29 years without being able to explain it. She had always told the researchers who came to her archives about the collections that weren't yet catalogued, the fonds that were technically closed, the materials that were sleeping. She had always said, "Someone should look at this." She had never been the one to look. She called Derek Pallister on the morning of the 5th day. "I'm not selling," she said. "I appreciate the offer, but this property isn't mine to redevelop. I'm the custodian of it, and I intend to act like one." Silence. Then, "Miss Alderton, that's a significant amount of money to leave on the table." "I know," she said. "Thank you for the offer. Goodbye." She put the phone down and stood very still in the station kitchen for a moment. She was breathing fast. Then she started making calls. The first was to Library and Archives Canada, to a colleague she had known for 20 years, a cartographic archivist named, well, she asked her not to use her name, which Frances understood completely. Her colleague drove up to Harrow Lake the following Thursday and spent 6 hours at the table going through the map cases. She called the collection extraordinary. She used that word 3 times, which for a cartographic archivist is the equivalent of someone else crying. The maps would be formally assessed, documented, and if Frances agreed, accessioned into the National Collection with Evelyn Morrow's name attached to every one. Frances agreed. The second call was to the Parks Canada Heritage Office, which began a formal review of the station's eligibility as a designated heritage structure under the Federal Heritage Buildings Program. The review took 7 months. The designation was confirmed the following autumn. The station could not be demolished, could not be sold for commercial development, could not be altered without approval. Derek Pallister's resort compound was built on a different set of parcels 12 kilometers east. He sent Frances a brief, professional email informing her of this. She read it once and deleted it. The third was harder. She found, through patient archival work over 4 months, every letter writer she could still trace, or their descendants in most cases, given that many of the letters were 50 or 60 years old. She wrote 94 letters by hand, at Evelyn's table under Evelyn's lamp. She told them what she had found. She told them what she was building. She told them that Evelyn Morrow's station would not be a resort or a private compound but an archive and a residency. A place where writers and researchers and land surveyors and anyone who needed to be quiet for a while could come. Within 3 months, 67 of them had written back. Some sent $50. Some sent $500. Terry Odjick, the land surveyor from Yellowknife, who had been 14 years old on the ice in 1955, sent $3,000 in a letter that read, "I have told every student I have ever supervised about the day a woman I had never met went out on the ice and brought us in. I did not know her name, now I do. Thank you for that." The Papineau family from Ottawa, grandchildren of Henri and Marguerite, the family from the September storm in 1938, sent a photograph Frances had not known existed, a black and white image, probably from the early 1940s, of a woman standing outside the station in summer, one hand shading her eyes, looking toward the lake. On the back, in pencil, "Miss Morrow at the station, 1942. She gave us shelter." Frances had the photograph enlarged and framed and hung it on the wall above the Quebec heater, so that everyone who came through the door of the stations would see Evelyn Morrow looking toward her lake. In the first year, the fund raised $41,000. Frances used it to restore the interior of the station properly. The log walls rechinked, the oak floors refinished, the shelving units repaired and refilled, this time with Evelyn's field journals, properly archived and indexed, available to anyone who came to look. She began hosting people in the spring. A doctoral student in forest ecology from Laval, who spent 2 weeks working from Evelyn's maps and found them more accurate than the digital surveys available for the same terrain. A novelist from Fredericton, who had written a book about women in the Canadian Survey Service in the 1930s, and who had not known Evelyn Morrow existed. A retired Algonquin elder from Kitigan-Zibi who came for one afternoon and stayed for 3 days, looking at the vegetation maps, talking with Francis about the land knowledge encoded in the survey annotations. He said before he left, she was paying attention. Not many of them were. Francis put that in the station's guest book on the first page. In the second autumn, she organized a gathering at the station for everyone she had found, or who had found her, because by then the story had moved on its own, the way stories do when they have been waiting long enough for someone to tell them. She expected perhaps 15 or 20 people. 53 came. They drove up from Ottawa and Montreal and Kingston and Sudbury. The youngest was 31 years old, the granddaughter of one of the boys Evelyn had pulled from the ice in 1955. The oldest was 88, a woman named Odette from Shawville who had spent a night at the station in 1961 during a forest fire evacuation, who said she had thought about Evelyn Morrow every fire season since. They stood in the station and around the station in the cold autumn air with the birch trees bare behind them, and they talked and they held one another's hands, and a man from the low end of the lake played a fiddle tune that Hubert the librarian said was an old Quebec reel, that Evelyn had apparently been known to request. They stood around the Quebec heater with the photograph of Evelyn looking toward the lake above it, and they said her name. 53 people, most of whom had never met, all carrying the same small piece of the same life. Frances stood at the door of the station with her great-aunt Cecilia's notebook. She had been using it for notes since October, and she understood something she had been close to for a long time without quite arriving. Her great-aunt Cecilia had told her something once when Frances was 8 or 9 years old, sitting on the dock at Harrow Lake. Cecilia had been looking out at the water and she had said, not quite to Frances, more to the lake, "The people who do the quiet work, they don't get eulogies. They get found later by the right person if they're lucky." Frances had been 8 years old. She had not understood. She understood now. Cecilia had known Evelyn Morrow. Not well. She had told Frances once, long ago in passing, that there was a woman who lived up in the survey station, a solitary woman, serious about the forest. Cecilia had brought Frances to the lake, had bought the house on the lake, had left the house on the lake to Frances, and had never explained why the lake mattered so much. Maybe she had known and not said. Maybe she had trusted that Frances would eventually walk far enough up the trail to find out. Frances never remarried. She did not feel the absence of it. She lived in her great-aunt Cecilia's house on Harrow Lake and walked up to the station every morning, the way Evelyn had walked her survey routes, because the land asked for it, because the work was there, because it was enough. She ran the residency program, shepherded the archival collection, wrote an account of Evelyn Morrow's mapping work that was published in a Journal of Canadian Heritage Studies, which meant perhaps 2,000 people read it, which was 2,000 more people than had known Evelyn's name before. Some days she took the painted watercolor map down from where it hung above the oak table and rolled it out flat and stood over it, her hands at her sides, and looked at the whole Harrow Lake watershed the way Evelyn had seen it, the way you can only see a place after you have walked every inch of it for a very long time. That is what it means to belong somewhere. Not ownership, attention, paid long enough that the place carries your shape and you carry the place's shape, and when someone comes along afterward, they can feel both things at once. Evelyn Morrow had known this lake. Francis Alderton learned it. And one day after Francis was gone, someone else would unlock the station door and find the shelf of field journals and begin reading, and the circle would keep going. One shelter on a stormy night, one map drawn in a cold station in 1947, one crate nailed shut and waiting. One woman who drove north because she had nowhere else to go and found that nowhere else was, in fact, exactly the right place. If this story found you at the right moment, we'd love to know. Subscribe to Ultra Stories and tell us in the comments. Was there someone in your life who did the quiet work? Who kept going when there was no one watching? Say their name, tell us about them. The people who did that kind of living deserve to be spoken of. And somehow, in the way that things travel across time that we don't fully understand, we believe they hear it. See you in the next one.